Joining us, this is, as you may know, the last of our four-part series on nation souls. And today we have with us as panelists, Martha Orton, Jared Quek, and as well Vladimir will be joining as a panelist. So today the topics that will be discussed are nations and federations, as well as positive and negative nationalism. Before formally introducing our guest speakers, though, I'd like to make just two quick announcements about events coming up at LaGrasse. Just a reminder that we have this special full day LaGrasse event on October 8th called In Search of Your Inner Guide. And our keynote speaker is Dr. Brant Courtwright, whom we've hosted several times on New Perspectives. And so during this day of exploration and discovery, Dr. Courtwright and several other speakers will discuss how to find answers and directions in life that are aligned with our innermost being or true self. And we'll be having kind of practical tools and experiential exercises that we'll be sharing to help us tune into the presence of our inner guide when making choices and major decisions in life. So we hope you all can join us either live in person in Greenville at the Hyatt Regency, but this event is also being offered on Zoom, and I'll be putting in the chat box the URL, but you can find more detail on our just homepage of LaGrasse. As well, we have a second special event, which is being hosted by Namaha, the Journal of Integral Health, and it is a 6-day online interactive program with Vladimir, and the event is called Discourses with Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko. And during this program, Vladimir takes a look at the different paradigms of knowledge and combines and synthesizes them into a single perspective of integral yoga psychology. So the second event starts on Monday, September 9th, and we'll go through Saturday, and it'll be 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Indian Time, IST time. And again, both of these events, as well as other upcoming webinars, can be found on our homepage, www.lagrassecenter.com. So with that, let's get into the topic at hand. And I'd like to just formally introduce, first of all, Dr. Martha Orton. Welcome, Martha. So very nice to have you with us again. Martha has studied the works of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother for many years. She has experience in conducting workshops and online classes on Sri Aurobindo's thoughts. And she's a licensed social worker and an instructor at the Sri Aurobindo Center for Research. Martha has a Master of Arts in Semitic Languages and Literatures, and a Master of Social Work in Clinical Social Work, and a PhD in Sri Aurobindo Studies. She has published The Quest for Knowledge and Mastery, a comparative study of motivation in the light of Sri Aurobindo, and as well, she has published Journey to Oneness. So again, welcome, Martha. Very nice to have you here. And our second guest speaker is joining us from Singapore, Jared Quek. Jared as well, so nice to have you back again as part of our New Perspectives. And Jared has practiced the integral yoga in conjunction with Christian faith for over 20 years. And he holds 2 postgraduate degrees from the University of Oxford, specializing in Indian philosophy, Christian theology, and business administration. So Jared works in the educational sector and invests in technology companies. And lastly, Vladimir, whom you all know, has a master's degree in general and theoretical linguistics and in Sanskrit language and literature, and as well a PhD in Indian philosophy. He's a scholar and instructor of Sanskrit and an educator and research in Vedic and Vedantic studies. So Vladimir is the director of our Institute for Applied Research in Integral Studies here at the LaGrasse Center in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. So before turning it over to Martha, who will begin today's discussion on nation souls, I would just remind everyone we are certainly going to have time at the end for Q&A. And so if you have questions, post in the Q&A box. And if they're for a particular speaker, either Martha or Jared or Vladimir, you can indicate that in your question. Otherwise, we'll open your question up to all three. So with that, Martha, I'm going to hand it over to you to lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radha, for that lovely introduction. So today I'm going to talk about the ideal of human unity, pretty much summarizing what Sri Aurobindo has written in that book. And one of the goals that he writes about is the goal of human unity. And Sri Aurobindo actually considers that eventually realizable. And he has written in The Human Cycle that only by admitting and realizing our unity with others can we entirely fulfill our self-being, our true self-being. In the ideal of human unity, Sri Aurobindo describes the possible approaches which are available to humanity, including the various forms of government which exist and those that also may be attempted. And I know you all have heard about various possibilities in previous discussions. For a more complete understanding of Sri Aurobindo's perspective on social and political thought, we need to regard this within the context of his philosophy. One significant component of this is the reality of oneness, the complete unity of all things. Another essential foundation point is Sri Aurobindo's view of the human purpose of existence. We can see this in concert with his evolutionary perspective, since these combine in deeply meaningful terms. Sri Aurobindo asserts that the human purpose is to unite with the divine, doing so through the progressive evolution of consciousness, which results ultimately in the entire transformation of the being, all of the levels and aspects of being, into their divine counterparts, resulting in a complete union with the divine. For this evolutionary process to take place, the individual needs to have the freedom to develop his or her individual nature and characteristics, to have full or free range of expression of one's nature. Naturally, systems of government relate to this, since they have an impact on the life of the individual and the society within which one lives and seeks to thrive. For Sri Aurobindo, the urge to human unity is driven by nature. He explains that there are natural groupings which are the result of the human urge to gather and find congenial possibilities, which can also serve to ameliorate the stresses of life and offer a sort of protection. It is commonly remarked that human beings are social animals, and there is indeed a truth to that statement. The smaller groupings of family, clan, tribe are generally experienced as supportive, convenient, and as offering protection from whatever else is alien to each group. Groupings, or aggregates, as Sri Aurobindo sometimes calls them, tend to increase in size as they evolve. They grow into collectives such as cities, city-states, such as in medieval times. Modern examples are Vatican City and Shanghai. Also, as states and provinces, and sometimes even larger aggregates such as nations, federations, and empires. He observes that usually the greatest cultural flowering has occurred in the smaller groupings, such as cities or city-states, and that larger aggregates do not have such cultural richness. I think we can notice from our own observation the truth of that. Larger aggregates may be necessitated by defense, but these are at risk of falling into disorder and not lasting unless there's a more meaningful bond. The lives of smaller nations tend to be more vibrant, tend to impact each other with a resultant creativity and intensity. And these are ripe fields for cultural richness and diversity, such has been the case in Europe, as Sri Aurobindo observes. Nations are most commonly formed by external processes, such as the pressure of circumstances, including the threat of aggression. external pressure is also usually followed by a period of psychological molding, then a period of organization, and next a phase of free internal development. The ideal process, in Sri Aurobindo's terms, is for people to form national groupings according to natural affinities, such as language and culture, and that these not be based only on political, economic, or military considerations. As a nation develops, a conscious national ego develops also. Sri Aurobindo recognizes the reality of a national soul, essentially the communal consciousness of a nation, through which it expresses a psychological unity and through which it discovers its distinctness. Before discussing federations, let us consider empire, the most prominent example of which is the Roman Empire. Sri Aurobindo explains that this was able to achieve an organized unity beyond that of a nation and also to endure for a long time, particularly by overwhelming and assimilating the cultures which it conquered. He identifies advantages of empire as excellent organization, general peace and security, dependable order, widespread, though perhaps not general, material well-being. And the disadvantages are that the individual, city, and even the region can lose their independence and become parts of a larger organization, which has the qualities of a machine. Life can lose its color, richness, and variety, and the individual can be overpowered, overshadowed. This cannot serve the evolutionary purpose. So Sri Aurobindo concludes, understandably, that the unification by administrative or political means is far from ideal. Regarding empire, he identifies two types: homogeneous national, homogeneity of culture, composite national, separate nations united through an overarching organizational structure. And he also observes that, in a sense, all empires are composite if we consider their origins. Sri Aurobindo cites the United States as an example of a composite national empire, since its states are very diverse, and he explains that for the US to evolve from a political, mechanical aggregate to any kind of psychological unity, the powers of the individual states need to be maintained. He observes that the success of the Roman Empire was due to its suppression of the indigenous cultures, and this resulted in eliminating the sense of separateness. And also, he foresees the model of a confederate empire as a possibility for the future. Confederations of nations or states and provinces generally may be somewhat loosely organized, and their durability is determined by the strengths of the central organization. Among these factors, too, is the motivation for their formation and the sense of cohesion, perhaps based on external threat, which may bind them together, or if the cohesion weakens, it may tear them apart. To some degree, a confederation of free, self-determining nations has the potential to fulfill the unification of humanity. This would become even more possible with the movement towards internationalism, in which humanity would be regarded as a single race of beings with a common life and common interests. Excuse me. In an ideal society, there would be harmony between the individual and the social aggregate. An ideal society would support or permit the perfection of the individual, and the individual would have the potential to contribute in return. Since nature values variety, as Sri Aurobindo observes, if a social structure cannot support this, it won't endure. He notes that the human being The human being, in general, exceeds the limits of the groupings, and if the grouping is too limited, it will not last. Overall, as Sri Aurobindo observes, there are two deep tendencies in humanity: individualism and collectivism. In essence, we need to honor and implement both in a harmonious fashion. He identifies three types of groups: the kind where the state or nation is paramount and the individual is subordinate to its control and power, such as the ancient Sparta; the kind of nation where the nation is paramount and the freedom and dignity of the individual are respected, such as ancient Athens. And then there's also the kind where the state fosters and encourages or supports the freedom of the individual and exists for its well-being. Sri Aurobindo notes that at one time, England was an example of such a state. The idea of the state or nation generally expects the individual to be subservient to the collective interest, essentially the subordination of the individual to the good of the collective. In reality, this can become a collective egoism instead. Sri Aurobindo explains that the demands of the nation or state, which are expected of the individual, are not consistent with the highest ideals that humanity is capable of, and also that the collective egoism is inferior to the highest ideals that the collective embodies. Individual egoism becomes collective egoism as it progresses. This can be tolerable if the role of the state were compatible with the flourishing of the life of the individual, if it really was the best organization for human progress. Sri Aurobindo asserts that the role of the state should be to provide the collective society with convenience and opportunities for the fullness of life, including order, security, and justice. He also points to several very relevant doubts related to the eventual development of human unity, noting that we can question whether collective egoism can be transcended or modified in order to reach an external unity. We can also question whether such an external unity can be established in such a way as to allow for freedom for individuals and the collectivity. We can also ask if some recognition of oneness, essentially a moral or spiritual oneness, could precede any economic or political attempt at unity. Sri Aurobindo asserts that a politically manufactured unity cannot last. There needs to be a psychological unity which can underlie and support an actual unity. In dire circumstances of threat, of war or foreign domination, this external pressure can result in the formation of a nation. And there's some historical instances where this has been the case. A psychological unity can consist of a collective consciousness, which can be regarded as the soul of a nation. And this can be effective in binding a nation together and helping it endure. Regarding human unity, the central question is how to create a federated empire of heterogeneous races and cultures and make them a natural psychological unity. National ego is inherent in the formation of a nation and also a really significant obstacle to a nation coming together. So in conclusion, an outer mechanical unity using administrative and political methods might be attainable. However, for this to be secure, a sense of unity and common interest is necessary. This is best achieved by grasping the reality of oneness, the reality which underlies what Sri Aurobindo calls the religion of humanity. Describing this, he writes, "A religion of humanity means the growing realization that there is a secret spirit, a divine reality, in which we are all one, that humanity is its highest present vehicle, that the human race and the human being are the means by which it will progressively reveal itself. So this is from the ideal of human unity. This understanding would make unity seem essential. In its intellectual acceptance, this is the basis for humanitarianism, philanthropy, and the concern for social issues. This would be supported by the natural trend towards increasingly larger aggregates. Also, as our wars become more disastrous in their consequences, and we may additionally note, as the threat of climate change increases, our sense of common interest may increase also. Usually, external threats tend to drive unification, there being a sense of protection in numbers and the strengths that unity can give, especially in working towards the common good. The psychological factor is even more important than national feeling for the formation of aggregates and for their preservation. What Sri Aurobindo calls the religion of humanity, when developed and more deeply recognized beyond the intellect, can be a powerful psychological force going beyond national sentiment and religion of country, for there truly can be religion of country. As a larger understanding or realization, it could become a replacement for patriotism. Sri Aurobindo asserts that eventually humanity will arrive at some form of unification. Factors influencing this may be a growing sense of unity, recognition of common interests, and evolutionary pressure caused by circumstances. These may result in either a centralized world state or a looser confederation, essentially a confederacy, which can support humanity's common interests. The confederacy would be highly preferable because of the latitude it would give, latitude of all kinds, especially for cultural expression. And a world state would risk being oppressive and could abolish national identity. A world state implies a mechanical unity and uniformity, suppression of creativity and variety. This could lead to stagnation and ultimately to the weakness of the structure, perhaps even to revolt. The risks of a looser confederacy are that this may be too easily divided and either result in a tightening of the organizational structure or dispersal of it. The real need is for the powerful psychological unifying factor that Sri Aurobindo refers to as the religion of humanity. This would provide the framework within which unity could be created, and its psychological power would enable the cohesion to endure. So, concluding, I would like to quote from Sri Aurobindo about the religion of humanity and about the recognition of oneness, which could bind humanity together. This is from the ideal of human unity. A spiritual oneness which could create a psychological oneness not dependent upon any intellectual or outward uniformity, and compel a oneness of life not bound up with its mechanical means of unification, but ready always to enrich its secure unity by a free inner variation and a freely varied outer self-expression. This would be the basis for a higher type of human existence. Very hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha, so much. Very, very interesting way of kicking off this session, and interesting summary comments that you made that I'm sure we're going to get some questions and comments from the audience. So I thank you so much, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Jared, to continue and expand upon some of these concepts and topics that Martha has introduced.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Martha. I would first like to expand on one of Martha's point, which goes, I would think, very centrally to the importance of this topic. I mean, why are we talking about national souls in the first place? So I think what Sri Aurobindo is a great should we say, a great champion of the importance of the individual, and not just the individual person, but the individual nation. And there is a very close parallel between, which he keeps on drawing, between the function of the individual soul, what he calls the psychic, and the national soul. So just as when a human being cannot reach our full potential, if we do not touch and live in our souls, and we cannot even relate to other people and to the divine properly without finding and living in our psychic. It's the same thing for nations. If a nation does not align itself with its unique soul form, it cannot reach its full potential. It will be destroyed gradually, or it will stagnate. If its institutions, its art, its language, especially language, Sri Aurobindo says that the language is the index of a nation's soul. It's not aligned to the national soul. The nation can never reach its full potential. So in the example given by Martha, which comes from the human cycle, about the Roman Empire, which he gave as a cautionary tale of how the Roman Empire brought a lot of benefits, but its very method of success is to crush out the individual cultures, the individual nations, the individual languages of the nations it conquered. One obvious example is ancient Egypt, right? By the time of the Romans, when Cleopatra fell into the embrace of Julius Caesar, we all know that story, right? Egypt is already 3,000 years old, at least. It has its own language, its magnificent architecture and all that. But what happened after the Romans took over? First, Greek was the language that was imposed upon Egypt. The Egyptians themselves lost the very knowledge of their own language by the time within a few hundred years. And it took the French, ironically, to rediscover through the Rosetta Stone, right? And suddenly the whole world began to know what the pyramid texts are talking about, what is Egyptian culture fundamentally about. But the world has lost ancient Egypt for a long time because its national identity and soul was obscured. I wouldn't say destroyed, but obscured by the Roman juggernaut, should we say. And it happened to many, many nations, most of which actually never even have the fortune of ancient Egypt to be recovered. Like, what do we know of the Celts today? Or of the many other little countries it squashed out of existence. And so the importance of today's topic is really that the nation's soul is something that must be found more and more, especially in the coming age of mental subjectivism or the spiritual age, so that nations can relate properly to each other, so that we can unite with each other and the divine, so that we can reach our full potential. So of course that opens to my main topic, which I have to do in quite summary fashion because this is we want to have more time for discussion. So Sri Aurobindo warns also in the example of Germany that Martha was also mentioning, how there are right and wrong ways of discovering the nation's soul. And just as in yoga, we can fall horribly in the path. Nations too can fall horribly in the path. If you identify with the vital, the body, as your nation's soul. So he basically said that Germany sought for its soul and found its force. Okay, so it identified with its life power, its dynamism, its will to power, and so on and so forth. It's the German, and of course its body, the physical power of Germany. And Germany was a very, very powerful nation, as we may remember in the 20th century, right, the first half in particular. And because it's identified with the wrong part of itself, thinking that is the German soul, the consequences was, should we say, spectacular, not just for Germany itself, but for the entire world. We all know what Germany did. So what is, therefore it brings me to, so what is the so-called safeguards to search for the national soul? And again, from what my thinking in my study is, again, we must go back to this important parallel as within, so without, right? Between the individual soul and the national soul. So whatever are the safeguards for the finding of the national soul, the individual soul, will be to some degree the same safeguards for the national soul. And here I'd just like to make a few points of a really complex topic, right? The first is that ultimately, I think there must be there will be certain nations which will be more apt to discover their own national souls first. And it is in these nations need to set an example, shall we say, to show that it can be done. Of course, one such special nation is, of course, India, which many of our speakers have spoken about. So I will not elaborate on that. And Sri Aurobindo has written extensively, needless to say, on India. I would just like to elaborate quite briefly, actually, on two special nations, which I believe have the potential to engage in this quest for their deeper identities quite successfully in the near or intermediate future, and perhaps open the way for other communities to do the same. So why do I choose these two? So I would like to go back to this important chapter in the Life Divine, which talks about how there are four main ways in which an individual can open up our inner being, which nature has opened up the inner being in individuals. The first is religion. The second is occultism. The third is spiritual philosophy. And the fourth is direct spiritual experience and action, direct yoga, so to speak. And these four are complementary. It's very interesting, but different nations, you will notice, actually it's almost like it's nature's plan, right? In the worldwide yajna, as Alok Pandey puts it, right? The worldwide sacrifice. Each nation brings something to the table, something unique and precious. And each nation's, I would say certain nations are particularly gifted in one or more of these. But only a few nations, I would say, have developed one, two, or three of these to a certain level of completeness. In fact, Sri Aurobindo himself says that in the future poetry, I do not know whether he meant it literally or as a figure of speech, there's only 2 or 3 peoples who have developed strongly the spiritual force in themselves. That's a kind of paraphrasing, not a direct quote, but that have developed the spiritual force strongly in themselves. Only 2 or 3 people. Of course, I'm not sure whether he literally meant 2 or 3 or a few, but it is a fact that if you look at history, only a small number of countries really have developed the spiritual path and opened up the inner being of either the elite to any significant extent. And usually these are the nations which will be quite strong in either occultism or religion or produce a lot of spiritual philosophy. India happened to be strong in all 4 of them. Yeah, which is why it's considered a special nation, which is uniquely suited to find its own soul and live in its own soul. And 2 other nations I will elaborate first is Israel, and the second is Tibet. So I'll just give a quick intro, should we say, on why I think these are nations that can be the vanguard of this. So Israel, I think, as we all know, especially in America, in the West, is really one of the key fountainheads of Western civilization, of the spirituality and religion of Western civilization in particular. So from this little country came essentially Judaism, Christianity, and later it inspired Islam in its own way as well. The Bible, for instance, is the creation of the people of Israel over about 1,000 years. And it was a country, a very old country, with a monarchy, with a capital city of Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And it distinguished itself with this very, very influential line of seers. Interestingly, the Hebrew word for seers is nabi, which is not very far from the Sanskrit word, which is kavi, seer, basically, prophet. These prophets created a line of spirituality that is very unique in its orientation. That my own belief is it culminated in the avatar, right, in Christ. And what distinguished this Israelite spirituality is really this focus, should we say, on number one, a collective realization. And secondly, on, should we say, a renovation or a transformation of society and of the earth. It's a very earthly spirituality, shall we say. And I'd just like to quote one very beautiful verse from Isaiah. Isaiah is, of course, one of the key nabis, right, the seers that we talked about, that I think summarize this, that captures some of the soul of this spirituality. So this is from Isaiah 65, right? For behold, I, the divine speaking, create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. So here we keep on hearing the word people. So it is clearly a collective kind of living in the divine presence, shall we say, that is deep in the Israelite soul. There's this myth or history, however you call it, that during the 40 years of wandering, where the Jewish people was wandering in the desert, God was dwelling in the midst of them in flames, in the form of a divine fire. The Jewish people call it in Hebrew the Shekinah, that means the presence. So that was part of the Jewish dream, shall we say, part of the Jewish soul and aspiration, shall we say, that the whole people can live in the presence of the divine. The whole people, not one person, but the whole people. And the second really important thing that's found, that came in later in Christianity, that Christ preached again and again, the kingdom of God, the reign of God, the renovation of the whole earth. That too is very important. And maybe it's not an accident at all that, on the flag of modern Israel, right, we have the Star of David, which is the two intersecting equilateral triangles, which is also found in Sri Aurobindo's symbol, interestingly. And the Star of David, the Messianic star, might perhaps be a link precisely to this transformation, or this is speculation. But I do know that the background of the Star of David is Kabbalistic. That means it's linked to Jewish mystical traditions. So very briefly, I would say that Israel has this deep spiritual mission that is of a special kind. And while today's modern Israel and the modern Jewish people may not necessarily be aligned or not so aligned, well, I mean, who can tell, right, to this? I believe that its long history and the fact that the Jewish people has been exiled so long, always searching for itself, has made it uniquely equipped actually to discover itself and its true mission in the intermediate future. And that will be something very important, I would think, for the world movement. So this is one nation I am interpreting in the light of Sri Aurobindo, which I mean I have some contact with since I have been steeped in the Christian faith while being a disciple of Sri Aurobindo as well. The second nation, maybe I need to speed up, is Tibet. Tibet has, so Sri Aurobindo mentioned occultism, which he defines in a very, should we say, complete and holistic way, as basically this inner sciences, which discovers those inner forces behind our minds, behind our spirits, behind our life, behind our body, and use these for whatever purpose. But Tibet has a special form of occultism, okay, which is Tantric Buddhism, right? In which this occult science is oriented firmly towards spiritual realization. And because of the tragic events of the last century, or 70 years or so, where Tibet was conquered by the communists and many people went into exile, Tibetan Tantricism happens to be one of the most, if not the most accessible system of the Tantra. You can find qualified teachers in most major cities because of the dispersion of the Tibetans, just like the Jewish people earlier, although the Jewish people did it for 2,000 years, which is much longer. And so I just read this from Sri Aurobindo, where he says about the Tantras, that it was not only a many-sided science of the supernormal, but supplied the basis of all occult elements of religion, and even developed a great and powerful system of spiritual discipline and self-realization. And that's the special thing about Tibetan Buddhism. And its aim, should we say. Tibet seems to be the one country that has safeguarded a kind of occultism that seeks the divine, however defined. I mean, seeks divine realization, spiritual realization. And it does that and the elements in it that causes it to be able to do that is actually very important for the coming age, I would say. Okay, just to be a bit more exact. So before you can enter into So just to give a bit of my own background is that, I mean, so I started in the Christian faith, but I was always exploring, right? So before I knew of Sri Aurobindo in my teenage years, actually I spent about 4 years studying Tibetan Buddhism. If I had not discovered Sri Aurobindo, actually I would most likely be some kind of Tibetan Buddhist, because it was something that was very appealing to me. And so this is speaking from my own personal discoveries as well. So one thing I found very inspiring about the Tibetan Tantricism is how it starts with this idea of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta means the so-called enlightenment consciousness, but it really means compassion. That you want to enter into the tantric path. You want to use all these occult meditations, mantras, and all that, not because you want to dominate the world and have more money or whatever it might be, but because you care, you love all living beings. You have this deep compassion to go out to serve and relieve suffering. And that is the driving force that should be. That means in Sri Aurobindo's term, maybe the psychic spark or some kind of compassion must be lit first before you're even worthy to enter into the path of Tantra. So, and that I thought is a marvelous safeguard, isn't it? And that's something that Tibet is a guardian of, that the psychic force, the force of love and compassion must be there before occultism can be safely used. And the second thing, of course, is that it couples it with a very well-developed spiritual philosophy. There were monastic universities in Tibet before they were destroyed. Okay, I don't know in what state they are now, but they are still existent in India, in Dharamsala. And basically, these are monastic universities, and they mean there's this training in discriminative wisdom and spiritual philosophy, which is another foundation. So you need compassion. You need discriminative wisdom as foundation before you can do the tantric practices. And of course, there's ethical practices as well, self-control and so on and so forth. So and Tibet safeguarded this very precious thing, I would say, because it's my personal belief that we are entering into the age of mental subjectivism, where what we call occultism or inner science is going to explode in prevalence. Our physical sciences is going to broaden into that. What I call even in my few last talks, the Atlantean curve, right, so to speak, the recovery of the old nation of Atlantis, or the old civilization of Atlantis, which brought mental subjectivism to a certain development, but did not manage to sustain it, should we say, fully. But so Tibet has that special mission as well. And I think it's another nation, just like Israel, who's highly qualified to discover what it's really about, what its inner national soul is. And so just to close, because we want to leave some time for questions, right? And it's really that I think this finding of the nation's soul is not some abstract thing. It is, in fact, if we can align ourselves to our nation's soul, that Americans can be truly Americans, and American institutions can be truly American institutions in the best sense of the word, that people could incarnate and use their native language, their native culture, live it out. If we can be instruments of to some degree, okay, we should be instrument only of the divine, of course, but if we are channels of the national soul, we reach our full potential. We help our nations reach their full potential. And the nations that can first touch and develop their nation's souls most effectively are bringing a very important service to the rest of the world and the rest of the human communities. So I will probably end here. I got some comments about Atlantis, but I think I'll bring them up only if it's relevant to the questions later. Okay, so I'll pass my time over to Vladimir.
Thank you, Jared, and yeah, look forward to your comments on Atlantis, and really appreciate your insights on Israel and Tibet. So very wonderful. And just to remind everyone, any questions for Martha, Jared, or Vladimir, please put in the Q&A, and we'll get to them in a little bit. But Vladimir is going to wrap this session up with some of his own thoughts and some concluding comments from the prior session. So Vladimir, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Radha. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Martha. Yes, these are very provoking and interesting insights on the nature of the nations. And we must also notice something very interesting, that nation phenomena, nationhood, Shubinder says, is a recent phenomena. It's not a phenomenon from the beginning of time. It's also something very important to understand, that it is like the psychic being is formed recently in the evolution of consciousness. It's not something which was there always as a psychic being. There was a psychic presence in nature, which was formed, individualized. That spark around started to form into the being using more mind, vital, physical, started to become more and more individualized formation. And with this, the support of the nations started to become more and more relevant. And I love this insight what Jared had, that it has something to do with individual development. So the appearance of nations as nation souls. It is not that it wasn't there in the presence of Earth. It was always there, psychic presence, but as a formation of a particular group of people, of a particular land, culture, history, language especially, the ways how people express themselves, how they communicate, how they understand, how they name the surrounding nature. They give the names to the rivers, to the mountains, to the trees, to the flowers. Everything is one big complex of relations of the soil, of the earth, with people living on it, and it has some psychic qualities. Now, when Martha was mentioning the world religion, that world religion, in the view of Sri Aurobindo, is the one which would not demolish any national upbringing or support. It will support every possible national as spiritual, as psychic. As spiritual supports psychic in his integral yoga, the same way the spiritual religion will support all the nations as individuals, as the bouquet of flowers. You know? And that richness and complexity is so needed, because nature doesn't want to create, monoculture or some kind of uniformity where everybody is the same robot, speaks the same language, and eats the same food. It wants to have the varieties and richness for the spiritual experience, for the ananda which has to be manifested. So in the first presentation, Dr. Basso gave us a very good overview also of the conditions of the appearance of nations, nationhood. And that is, first of all, the hierarchy has to be built, some kind of scaffolding. It's not really that which will endure, but which is only scaffolding the oneness. And then such elements as secularity. The society has to be secular to a certain extent, not religious. Why? Because without this political awareness, without secularity, without monarchy, something away from religion has to be built, because it will permit the psychic qualities to arrive. And then he mentioned also liberties. It's this third stage before we can arrive at the awareness of the nation's soul. And liberties have to be manifested in 3 different fields of endeavors: socio-religious, socio-political, and socio-economic. So we need to have freedom in religion, in politics, and economy as individuals. And that's why he is always praising England and the Commonwealth. He said it wasn't an empire, it was a Commonwealth. And just look at this name. And he compares different nations with different qualities. He says that imposing state order, Germany and other, such as Russia and other cultures which are more kind of looking communistic, socialistic, dominance of the social order, state order over individual is one type. Then there is another type which actually admits supremacy of the state, but with the help to individuals, such as, for example, ancient Greek tradition, or modern France, he mentions. And then he comes to England and says England is standing out as a servant. So the state is a servant of the development of individual liberty is the major topic. And you can see immediately, even in the modern times, so with this war between Russia empire, which wants to grab Ukraine back to its own empire, and to make it its own again. And who supported Ukraine in its independence fighting? First, it was Britain. It was England. They came. They were totally first friends of Ukraine. And this is amazing. England and United States. These are the two countries which are valuing liberty, the individual freedom most. The rest are kind of catching up, politics. Look at how Germany reacts. You will learn everything from what Sri Aurobindo says in his books, The Human Cycle and the Ideal of Human Unity. This is an amazing knowledge which is going far beyond our immediate perception of things, and he is dealing with archetypal forces. And that's the beauty of the studies of his books. So here I will basically stop because of lack of time, and open to the questions. There are some questions here. I have also more questions to both of you, but let us follow with the questions which are already written down here. Shall you do the questions? Yeah.
Sure. Would that make it easier? Absolutely. Happy to. And please continue to post your questions. We do have time here. So the first one, namaste. Do you consider that the karma of a nation can impact the awakening of the nation's soul? What is your opinion about this question of karma of nations? Thank you. So for anyone that would like to address that first. Karma of a nation and how it impacts a nation's soul. Jared?
Well, I guess in Sri Aurobindo's teachings, nothing that has lived will ever die. It lives somewhere in the subconscious. So and nations do have a subconscious. So what nations do or collectively may be seemingly gone in the stream of time, but it is there. And so clearly what we know as karma, samskara or whatever, there are traces. It clearly will shape things for good or for ill. So if a nation has reached a high level of culture but has somehow lost it, you will find it much, much easier to recover that level of culture. I think Sri Aurobindo wrote about that in The Human Cycle, how Italy was doing Dante's and all those things while Germany was still producing much less, because the blood of the Greco-Romans, the traces are in the blood of Italy, are in the subconscious of Italy. So in those more profound sense, it's there. And in fact, that may be a good way to segue also into the question on Atlantis, right? Which rather you were asking about. So I think what I mentioned in previous talk, I suppose, was that if we look closely at the writing of Sri Aurobindo and of course at the myths and legends of the world, they appear to be this great lost civilization that supposedly have mastered something like an integral kind of occultism, the inner sciences, the outer sciences, but it had a tragic fall. But my point is, or more like, Sri Aurobindo seems to predict an era where we will rediscover all these inner sciences. We will look at ourselves more as creatures of the mind, that human beings are mental beings, and we define these mental beings as not in the narrow sense of having a brain and little reason, but mental beings with all the deep and vast capacities of the mind and the inner self. And this is something that Atlantis was supposed to have done before. So we talk about national karma. It is something that in some long forgotten time, there was a very specially gifted community that has already done it once. Didn't succeed fully. In fact, my own view is they may never have disappeared as completely as we thought they have. But regardless whether they have or not, what they did left a trace, both to make it more possible for us as a whole to do it again. But unfortunately, the trace they left includes that fall that is remembered in Plato, right? The abuse of the inner sciences. And that abuse, that bad choice that the Atlanteans made, is likely to haunt the whole of humanity as we re-enter mental subjectivism. It's something, a shadow that we need to conquer. And I think that usually it works like that in any nation. But Atlantis was perhaps especially special because it was perhaps like well at the forefront at that time. And its fall has big consequences for the whole of humanity, not just for itself. So maybe I stop here and see whether Martha or Vladimir want to talk about this.
And Martha, you're muted if you wanted to say something.
Thank you. Regarding karma, Sri Aurobindo's perspective on this is that the only karma that sticks to an individual is what serves his growth and progress, and as evolutionary progress. So I'm assuming that that would be true for a nation as well, that national karma would be whatever suits its, karma that would be implemented, karma that would apply would be the karma that serves to the growth of that nation, its development as a country, its development of its soul, its development of its understanding of itself. So I hope that would be true, because certainly we see so many countries behaving in destructive ways, both for the planet or for other nations. So karmic consequences seem very significant. And if they would serve to the growth of the understanding of the soul of that nation, that would be very productive and very good long term.
Yeah, it's a very good answer, by the way, that karmic consequences and karmic kind of historic past is interwoven into the very task which has to be addressed by nature. Nature is working out something which we have no idea about. She experiments with different modalities, different formations. Sri Aurobindo always speaks about this. So she comes to the end of this Roman Empire and says, "It's enough is enough. I don't repeat the same story. I exhausted the possibilities." And every time somebody tries to replicate the modality of Roman Empire, he comes to the failure because the nature is not interested to go in that direction. So he looks at nature as if the conscious active element, or the presence or the Shakti of the divine, who is working out something here for the future. What is interesting that Sri Aurobindo looks also at this, that nature does not allow individual to come to the unity immediately. It doesn't allow him to come to the holistic, to become the citizen of the world, as it were. It builds the aggregates slowly. Yeah, first family, then clan, then city, then kingdoms, then finally something of the kind of the nations, when the culture and language is common for all, the history. And he describes beautifully how nations are born and because they first become empires and then they come back to their own, borders, and they become aware of their own belonging to the land. And then he says that these aggregates, and the nation is the last aggregate, which he is building now, and it is dominant in the world, and it will become the most powerful now, is the spirit of the nations. And all these aggregates are necessary to develop more complex relations, mental, vital, physical, because it's not enough to have uniformity. That's why she works out all possible formations and formats of relations. And they are all somehow present there for the possibilities of relations and richness of life. This is an amazing thought, actually.
Thanks, Vladimir. Jared, this next question is directed towards you. Jared, I would request you to throw some light on the external conflicts in Israel-Palestine, more politically backed in the light and spirituality of nation soul.
Yeah, that is a controversial question very clearly. So I'll try to take it from the light of Sri Aurobindo. It's controversial because obviously how you view the very tragic conflict between the two brothers actually is often determined by the political ideologies of the people involved. So I think we should try to hopefully rise above that level. I mean, in this kind of forum, right? So, I mean, going back to the beginning, both the Jewish and the Arab people both view their ancestor as one and the same man. That's quite an irony, Abraham, right? So they both acknowledge each other as brothers, but clearly they're not very happy brothers living together. And maybe that is part of the heart of the issue, right? If you take it from the perspective of the Jewish national soul, you will find in the Hebrew prophets this immense concern for justice, social justice. That is one of the very key determining characteristic of Jewish spirituality. There's this great concern for social justice. So it's not about God being far away and you soar up there and say bye-bye. And it's about how you reform society in the image of the divine perfection, shall we say. The prophets have that thousands of years ago. It's perhaps no accident that Mr. Karl Marx is actually a secular Jew, with his idea of communism, right? So in that case, if a nation, just like what the mother says, a nation or a person or nation with a great capacity for light will find a corresponding shadow next to that person. That shadow is that which needs to be conquered before you can attain that light. And which is what Martha's point exactly, that the karma that it still exists, or the samskara is because the soul or nature, Prakriti, finds it helpful, right? So the Israel-Palestine thing is really a war of two brothers. And ultimately, Israel has to resolve it on the basis of divine justice, not human justice, divine justice. But the current state of Israel is a very secular state. Whatever I said about the high-flown ideals and all, is Israel, the people of Israel right now is going through a phase where it identifies itself largely with the physical land, with its vital, with its mind maybe, but not so much with the spirit, not so much. Of course, I'm generalizing. Perhaps this is the shadow. The only way Israel can resolve this in some kind of harmonious way is to know and enact divine justice, which, by the way, is what the Israeli mission is very much about in the first place. They need to know God and live it out, to use those terms. Yeah, so I mean, that's the best answer I can give. I'm really not going to go into all the stuff about all those who came here first and when. I think some of us here are familiar. Yes.
There is an interesting point here that nation without land, Sri Aurobindo says that the land and political embodiment and all that structure is actually secondary. It's more mechanical to the soul. And so the nation is already there without the land. Can you imagine? Without the country. So it comes
Yeah.
back to its own place where it started to acquire the place for its own embodiment. So to say, from the point of
Yes.
view of the whole technology of nation soul working on the building of the country, it's totally understood from the point of view of Sri Aurobindo's
Yes.
explanation.
So, but of course, the question is, does it have to be that piece of land? In fact, the British wanted to give Zimbabwe or somewhere. No, I think it was what was that big Madagascar to the Jews.
They wanted
Obviously,
to acquire Crimea. You remember Crimea, the whole discussion. It
yes,
was even purchased from Lenin and it was given so many, I don't remember, 10 million golden rubles that time. It was a huge amount to acquire Crimea for Jews to live there. And then it
yeah,
was, and Crimea, until now, it's a big problem for the whole world. Yeah, from that
yes.
time on.
But the unfortunate, or I mean, but the fact is, Israel, I mean, in its thinking, its literature, its spirituality has always looked towards Jerusalem, the physical Jerusalem, and the land of Israel as a gift of the divine. So for them, no other land will suffice. And
Absolutely, absolutely.
yes, there
And
is,
have
and
you read Jerusalem? How Jerusalem is being described? I was surprised, and even saw the plane how it is being planned. It reminded me of Auroville, exactly the same planning, with the temple in the center, with the streets going around like when I saw it, and even the slogans, how it should be like a representative of the heaven on earth, and all the whole theory behind it, Jerusalem, and even the wall around it, which Mother wanted to build around Auroville, is something of the same kind of idea trying to embody itself again in the world.
of course, yes. In fact, I'm very sure Sri Aurobindo and the mother was in ancient Israel in some form. Some say he was King Solomon, in fact. So it is Israel brings a very important part to the spiritual transformation of the earth, which is why it, like India, it's faced with an immense shadow as well. And the sufferings and tribulations the Jewish people have to go through is, I mean, well known to many, right? So to be the chosen people is not is no mean feat. You have to go through a lot, just like any person going through individual yoga has to go through a lot. Yeah, so I think maybe that hopefully is enough for that question. Yeah, but I hope it did pique the interest of some of us to find out more about, yeah, in the light of Sri Aurobindo, because the mother herself, as most of us know, is partly Jewish. Yeah. And there were a Jewish website which claims her as a Jewish holy woman. So in a way, she brings that strand to the whole picture as well, in some fashion.
Here we may mention to conclude the whole series that Mother created the symbol for Sri Aurobindo from two elements. One is Jewish or Semitic tradition or Chaldean tradition, yeah? And that is the six-cornered star of Solomon or David's star. And the other is the lotus within, yes, with seven flowing waters. And this lotus is the avatar, the Vedic tradition, because there was pre-Chaldean, pre-Vedic tradition, which was combining the spirit and matter together, spiritual manifestation, yeah, so to say. And then they got split into India, Advaitic, more, and the more alchemist and occultist in the East, in the Middle East, and finally in Europe. So Semitic tradition started to practice alchemy, and which came to be this science and more to empower people to make them power, kind of to give them power over nature, and forgetting slowly moving away from the spiritual perception, whereas in India it was just the opposite. Everything was fixed on the spirit, and nature was neglected slowly. So these two now have to come back together, and this is the oneness of the spirit and nature, or the East and West, And this is a good point to finish the whole series for us.
I just want to thank you all for really such an intriguing and interesting discussion. I think we need to do more panel type webinars because it really brings in a lot of different thoughts and diversity of comments. So we really thank you all, Martha, Jared, and of course, Vladimir. And Vladimir, did you want to say a little bit about next Saturday's webinar that we have coming up?
Right, we will have a webinar on UNESCO and the relation of UNESCO with Auroville. It's a long-standing relations and all the resolutions which UNESCO had on Auroville, and now new resolutions are coming up, and how and why that Auroville, that project of Jerusalem, yeah, in a way embodied in the spiritual sense somewhere in India for some reason, is important for the whole world as an experiment in the human unity. Because as Mother says, our will is to become the cradle of the Superman and the embodiment of the actual human unity. And this is something what we are discussing in our webinars. And Auroville has plays the central role. It's their project of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo. So these relations with UNESCO are quite important. There will be the whole meeting in Paris in September 30th of September. And we want to make one webinar before and discuss these topics. So all are welcome if you, the same time as we had today.
Thank you. And thank you all once again, and have a wonderful rest of Sunday, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you.